All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Erich Maria Remarque. So this is a book. It's more famous as the movie. I guess that's the way things are nowadays. We're of the generation that we watch a lot of movies, but we don't watch a lot of books. It's an old movie now, 1930s I think it's from. They remade it, but the famous version is from the 1930s. But if you haven't seen the movie yet, it's worth watching. In this day and age, there are a lot of pro-war movies masquerading as anti-war movies. So it's good to be reminded of what a true anti-war movie looks like. Something like Saving Private Ryan was very upfront about showing the horrors of the war. But the movie also kind of ended with a swell of American flags waving in the background and patriotism. I felt like the message from a movie like Saving Private Ryan was, war is terrible, but in the end it's worth it for a good cause. That's not the message you get from All Quiet on the Western Front. There's a very famous scene. You can look this scene up on YouTube actually, where the main character Paul comes back to the classroom and he sees his old teacher is still giving the same patriotic speech to the next generation that the teacher had given to Paul and his friends before they left for the war. So Paul walks in on him. He hears the old teacher making the speech and he says, "I heard you in here reciting that same old stuff, making more Iron Men, more young heroes. You still think it's beautiful and sweet to die for your country, don't you? We used to think you knew. The first bombardment taught us better. It's dirty and painful to die for your country. When it comes to dying for your country, it's better not to die at all. There are millions out there dying for their country. And what good is it?" So again, you can read the whole speech or watch the clip on YouTube. You don't get Hollywood movies like that nowadays. Certainly not big budget Hollywood movies. You probably could never secure the funding to make a movie like that nowadays. So the movie is something. It's worth seeing. Now, why read the book? Well, for one thing, it's a short book. You could probably read it in a few days easily, and then you'll have yet another classic of Western literature under your belt that you can brag about at cocktail parties. But more importantly, the book lets you get inside the minds of the characters in a way a movie can't. In a movie, you just watch people run around the screen. In the book, you can actually share their thoughts and see what they are thinking. I think we've all seen some sort of movie about a war veteran having trouble adjusting to civilian life after they come back from the war. I've seen this in a lot of movies before, but I never really understood it. I mean, I understand that the war is terrible, but once they get away from the war, once they get away from the battlefront, I always thought, well, wouldn't they enjoy being back in civilian life? In fact, wouldn't they cherish civilian life all the more now that they've come from that horrible experience? I couldn't understand why they'd have trouble adjusting back to civilian life. But after reading All Quiet on the Western Front, I felt like I really got a sense of how these men could never go back to civilian life again. You understand their headspace well enough by the end of the book that you just know they can't readjust. And along with that, I felt like I understood with kind of new clarity the meaning of the phrase, the lost generation. Yeah, you understand how this generation is just never going to be the same again. There's a passage in which the soldiers are coming back from the trench warfare at the front. So they're on a sort of shore leave. They're temporarily relieved from the trench warfare. and they realize a play is going to be put on for the soldiers. And they ask each other, is it possible these kind of things still exist? Or there's another passage when Paul, the main character, he's on leave back home from the war. And he can't stand the company of any of his old school teachers. And that also illustrates the feeling. Or there's Paul's thoughts. He's injured, he's lying on the bed in the hospital, and the book lets you get into his thoughts. And he wonders, what good are thousands of years of Western civilization if they couldn't have prevented this massacre? I'm really not doing justice to any of these sections by just kind of ripping them out of context and just kind of describing them in a few words. You need to read the book, and if you do read the book, you can really get into these characters' heads, and you get a real sense of just how lost these men are after the war. There are, as you would expect in a war novel like this, there are lots of battle scenes. Some of this does get a little bit repetitive. It also at times is predictable. I don't know, maybe the cliches of kind of a war story weren't that yet established back in 1920s when Remarque wrote this novel, but they certainly are now. So I trust I'm not giving anything away when I tell you that kind of all the characters die one by one. Best friend character dies at the very end in a particular senseless way. I don't think that's spoiling. You can kind of see these things coming a mile away. It's not really a pleasant read, and it often gets depressing. But I guess you don't pick a book up like this expecting light reading. The most depressing thing about this book is how little we as a society seem to have learned from the book and from the war. I mean, if the world had learned from World War I, then at least the book would have some hopefulness to it. We had this terrible war, but we've learned our lesson, and we're never going to have a terrible war like this again. But of course, we've had much more terrible wars, and it seems like nowadays, the kind of blindless patriotism that got us into World War I in the first place, or got Europe into that war in the first place, is just on display all over again.